Good afternoon, London News. Today is the 29th of September. Still in lockdown in Melbourne, unlawfully, even the word illegal. And we have a forgetful Daniel Andrews who knows whether he did it or not. Anyway, I'd like you to introduce you again to Alan Jones from Sky News. And I have to eat humble pie because there is a law professor, Professor Flint. Now, I have not much thought for the legal profession. Actually, I hold them in this total disdain, but by God, this is an exemption. At the end of this little program of Sky News, this professor is interviewed by Alan Jones, and he explains the situation brilliantly. So let's go and have a look without further ado.
Well, now, each new chapter that's written on this Victorian fiasco, and no other state jurisdiction is without blame, by the way, each chapter is worse than the previous one. The Melbourne curfew has been lifted, but if you dare celebrate with a party, each person will be fined $5,000. Any evidence to justify this police state? None. Face masks are compulsory. What does the evidence say about face masks for everybody? And even today, medical experts are saying this is absurd. But of course, the hospitality and retail industries are still in lockdown, bleeding to death. What is the justification? None. Andrews said so. People like Nobel Prize winner Professor Michael Levitt has argued that Australia's policy on aggressively suppressing the virus was basically a waste. The former UK Supreme Court Judge Lord Jonathan Sumption said, quote, "The real question is this serious enough to warrant putting most of our population into house imprisonment, wrecking our economy for an indefinite period, destroying businesses that honest and hard-working people have taken years to build up, saddling future generations with debt, depression, stress, heart attacks, suicides, and unbelievable distress inflicted on millions of people who are not especially vulnerable and will suffer only mild symptoms or none at all. So the real question is," said Mr Justice Sumption, "is all this imprisonment and wrecking of the economy justified?" Well, the answer, of course, is emphatically no. Indeed, Professor Levitt has crunched a lot of data on cases and deaths. A Nobel Prize winner. Mandatory masks, he found, made no difference. And if anything, he found lockdowns tended to increase deaths and slow down the speed at which the pandemic burnt out. And remember, as we're breathlessly told about new cases, and no one tells us that they're close to 100% are mild, the Australian government's own Department of Health says, and I quote, "The reliability of COVID tests is uncertain. Further, there is limited evidence available to assess the accuracy and clinical utility of available COVID-19 tests." But never mind, the dictatorial edicts continue, and not just in Victoria. Hundreds of pubs and bars and clubs may go under. Businesses are taking on unsustainable levels of debt, and in Victoria alone, 50,000 jobs in the hospitality industry are at risk. Who cares? Andrews and the bureaucrats don't, nor does any Premier or Federal Minister. They've taken every cent of their salary since day one. And now Daniel Andrews has thrown his Health Minister under a bus, slaughtered her last week at the hotel quarantine inquiry. I've never met this Jenny Makakos, but since she honourably quit the ministry, the government and the parliament, she has been commended as a hard-working servant of the people. Apparently mates with Andrews. He hasn't spoken to her. As one senior member of the Labor Party said, it comes down to trust, and there's not a lot of trust when it comes to Andrews. Why, in the quarantine inquiry, has witness after witness from the Premier down couldn't recall who put the security at the hotels in the hands of untrained private security guards? Not one minister or public servant could recall. Not one. Why? Easy to explain. They've been well briefed. Andrews introduced frighteningly tough industrial manslaughter legislation early this year. The aim, of course, was to jail the boards of top corporations should they be linked with death in the workplace. So have the government and its public servants been responsible, quarantining, for unsafe work practices? Because there was no proper training of the security guards, this has led to the spread of the infection and the deaths of many people. The legislation was at the behest of Andrews' union mates, designed to grab the corporate tall poppies. But the industrial manslaughter clauses don't exempt public servants and ministers. So no one will admit to knowing anything about the employment of untrained private security guards. I will be returning to that issue tomorrow, but let me say this. If you can prove they tell lies on one front, Isn't it a fair conclusion that in order to protect themselves from industrial manslaughter prosecution, and by the way, I don't think they can, then of course to a man and woman, they will deny having anything to do with the employment of private security guards. Which brings us to the issue of truth. This is Daniel Andrews on March 28, announcing that he was grateful for the Australian Defence Force offer. Now, I'll play this a couple of times. Here he is on March 28.
We'll utilise private security. We'll also utilise members of Victoria Police, and I'm very grateful to the Prime Minister for his offer of support from the Australian Defence Force.
There you are. Now, let's look at him last Friday, September 25, being questioned at the quarantine inquiry. Let's go again. Note on March 28, he said, I'm very grateful for the offer of support from the Australian Defence Force. Then, on Friday, I don't believe the ADF support was on offer. It's fundamentally incorrect to assert that Defence staff were on offer and somehow someone said no. Let's put these both together again. This is March 28, and the second one is last Friday.
We'll utilise private security. We'll also utilise members of Victoria Police, and I'm very grateful to the Prime Minister for his offer of support from the Australian Defence Force.
The question is, why did you choose to use private security guards rather than police or ADF?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned the use of ADF. I don't believe ADF support was on offer. And ADF support has been provided in very limited circumstances in New South Wales. So again, I think it is fundamentally incorrect to assert that there was hundreds of ADF staff on offer and somehow someone said no.
Daniel Andrews, both cannot be correct. You were on oath on Friday, but you also issued a press release on March 27. It was about quarantine arrangements, in which one paragraph says, and I quote, "It's also been agreed that the Australian Defence Force will be engaged to support the implementation of these arrangements." Daniel Andrews, will you tell the Victorian people that on at least one of these instances you've not told the truth and you should resign? But finally, lockdowns, quarantine, draconian know-all edicts issued by every leader, not just by Daniel Andrews. A private sector recession led from Canberra. Businesses crushed, jobs crushed, the education of teenagers vandalised. I've asked from day one why not one political leader has told us that 99% of cases are mild. Well, have a look at these figures from the American Centre for Disease Control, issued last week, headed COVID Survival Rate. Have a look at them. 0 to 19 years, 99.997% survive. 20 to 49 years, 99.98%. 50 to 69 years, 99.5%. 70 plus years, 94.6%. Now remember, this includes all the people with comorbidities. Further, let's look at this pie chart. This is for Australia alone, leading killers. Have a look at it. Cancer, 26.06%. Heart disease, 17.52%. Alzheimer's and dementia, 10.8%. Stroke, 7.9%. Lung disease, 6.58%. Diabetes, 3.53%. Flu and pneumonia, 2.89%. Coronavirus, 0.87%. Well, have a look at the table which puts the figures in silos. Third from the left is coronavirus, barely visible. Yet now we face a debt pile that you can't see from outer space. We've crippled business. People have died from other diseases which have been clinically bypassed because of this obsession with coronavirus. I told you we need a national advertising campaign to be told the truth. Politicians, I'm not suggesting deliberately, politicians out of sheer ignorance and listening to the wrong people have been the architects of this mess. And they've gone so far down the road they don't know how to turn back. So now they'll throw more borrowed money at us to try to solve the problem, not created by coronavirus, but by a government response to coronavirus that has been out of all proportion to the problem. And why do the polls seemingly favour these failed leaders? Well, day in, day out, they've told us this is a pandemic. Look out, you're all going to die. And if you do not, as we say, well, you wake up and you're alive and you think, oh, how grateful am I for Scott and Josh and Anastasia and Gladys and Dan and Steve and Mark, all their other sycophantic acolytes who've not had the gumption or the guts to say, might there be some other advice instead of surrendering to every utterance of so-called chief medical officers? Goebbels, the German Nazi politician and Minister for Propaganda from 1933 to 1945, one of Hitler's closest and most devoted associates, got it right when he said, and I quote, "If you tell a lie big enough and keep repeating it, people will eventually come to believe it. The lie can be maintained only for such time as the state can shield the people from the political, economic and/or military consequences of the lie. It thus becomes vitally important for the state to use all its powers to repress dissent, for the truth is the mortal enemy of the lie, and thus, by extension, the truth is the greatest enemy of the state." Do we have one political leader with the guts to tell us the truth? Can I take you to Donald Trump, given that many people would not be aware that law professors can nominate someone for the Nobel Peace Prize? Are you and other distinguished professors, Zimmerman, Moens and James Allen, writing to nominate Donald Trump for what he's done in the quest for world peace?
Yes, we have. It is the third nomination of Donald Trump for the Nobel Peace Prize, and it is based on the Trump Doctrine. The Trump Doctrine is something extraordinary, as so many things that Donald Trump does. He is guided by two things which seem to be absent from so many politicians. He has, firstly, common sense, and he is only guided by a national interest and therefore, in our circumstances, an interest in the Western alliance. And what he has done with the Trump Doctrine is that he has decided that he would no longer have America involved in endless wars, wars which achieve nothing but the killing of thousands of young Americans and enormous debts imposed on America, and nothing solved in the countries in which it is carried on. So he's reducing America's tendency to get involved in any and every war.
And then, of course, the peace deal. Yeah, the peace deal between Israel and the United Arab Emirates, 9 other Middle Eastern countries. I mean, if any other president did this, the whole world would be barking Nobel Prize.
Exactly. And what he has done is he decided to negotiate that on the basis of going against expert advice. Everybody told him, oh, no, you must first get the approval of the Palestinians. Now, the Palestinians are led by a dictatorship. They're dominated by a dictatorship. They'll never agree to anything. When Yasser Arafat was given almost the world by Bill Clinton, he's found some reason not to accept it. They don't want peace, not the leadership. The people certainly want peace, of course they do. But what Trump did was he went ahead and negotiated against all advice, but he did it with common sense. He negotiated directly with the Arab states concerned and Israel and brought them together, and these states are lining up, Arab and Middle Eastern, to join that network of peace which will dominate the Middle East. He's also been the first American president to work out how to make America energy independent of the Middle East. So he's not dependent anymore. America's not dependent anymore on Middle Eastern oil as all previous administrations were. But he's been able to go ahead with this. He's calmed tensions in relation to Korea. He's withdrawn from the ridiculous agreement that Obama made, which allowed the mullahs to obtain an enormous amount of money from America, including money flowed in cash to Tehran from the United States, which they invested in terrorism and which allowed them to develop nuclear weapons. He's withdrawn completely from that. He is really producing peace in the world in a way which none of his predecessors did.
Great
and he
stuff.
fully deserves the Nobel Peace Prize.
Good on you. Wonderful stuff. And, of course, you omitted to mention there he sensibly withdrew from that ludicrous Paris Agreement.
Oh, yes. Yes. He's the only Western leader who's decided that he will not ruin his country by signing up and complying with the Paris Agreement, which is ridiculous. In this country, for example, it's given us the most expensive electricity in the world, whereas we should really have the cheapest.
Absolutely.
Because we're the biggest uranium, the biggest iron ore, the biggest coal exporters in the world.
Wonderful. Wonderful to talk to you. Thank you for your scholarship. Thank you for your insights. We'll now follow as to whether Linda Dessau, the Governor of Victoria, does go by what you say, to exercise her reserve powers and withhold assent from some of that ridiculous legislation. Good to talk to you, Professor Flint. Very grateful for your time.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that, because by God, it was valuable information on what's going on in this absolutely criminal situation we have. Corporations masquerading as governments. They're all independent, private companies, owned and controlled. No separations of power. So it's London News sign off. Thanks for watching, guys. Keep tuned and watch Fox News. It gives you the truth as well. And Alan Jones again and The Outsiders give you some real feeling for what's going on. They do their best to tell the truth. And by God, Alan Jones is doing his best. Thanks for watching. London News signing off. I will go live again soon. I promise. I don't know what I'll talk about, but bye for now. Bye.